Without further ado, I'd like to bring on to the podium Miss Marilyn Hollifield, partner at Holland and Knight, and she will introduce the panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce the presenters for this program. Richard Blanco says he was made in Cuba, assembled in Spain, and imported to the USA. His family fled Cuba after the revolution and eventually settled in Miami. As a child, he possessed a strong creative spirit, but also excelled in math and the sciences. In fact, before obtaining a master's in fine arts from Florida International University, he worked as a consulting engineer. Mr. Blanco released his first book of poetry in 1999, City of 100 Fires, which won the Agnes Lynch Starrett Poetry Prize. In 2005, he published Directions to the Beach of the Dead, which received the Beyond Margins Award. His 2012 collection of poems titled Looking for the Gulf Motel touches on his life as a gay man negotiating space between domestic and immigrant cultures. When he was chosen as the 5th inaugural poet of the United States for President Barack Obama's second inauguration, Mr. Blanco followed in the footsteps of the greats like Elizabeth Alexander, Maya Angelou, and Robert Frost. He tells the story of that experience in For All of Us, One Today, an inaugural poet's journey. His latest book, the memoir, The Prince of Los Cocuyos, A Miami Childhood, explores his coming of age within two imaginary worlds, his parents' nostalgic 1950s Cuba and his imagined America, the country he saw on reruns of The Brady Bunch and Leave It to Beaver. Richard Blanco's personal narrative is a resonant account of how he discovered his authentic self and ultimately a deeper understanding of what it means to be an American. Roz Chast is a National Book Award finalist for nonfiction. Her cartoons have been published in many magazines, including The New Yorker, Scientific American, Harvard Business Review, Red Book, and Mother Jones. She is the author of Theories of Everything, Selected, Collected, and Health-Inspected Cartoons of Roz Chast, 1978 through 2006, a compilation of her favorite cartoons. She also illustrated the alphabet from A to Y with bonus letter Z. The best-selling children's book by Steve Martin. Her awards and honors include honorary doctorates from Dartmouth College, Lesley University Art Institute of Boston, and Pratt Institute. She is also a member of the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences and a Montgomery Fellow at Dartmouth College. Her latest book, Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant, a memoir, told through four-color cartoons, family photos, and documents. Her memoir is both comfort and comic relief for anyone experiencing the life-altering loss of elderly parents. While the particulars are Chastian in their idiosyncrasies, the themes are universal. Adult children accepting a parental role, aging and unstable parents leaving a family home for an institution, dealing with uncomfortable physical intimacies, managing logistics, and hiring strangers to provide the most personal care. A portrait of two lives at their end and an only child coping as best she can. Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant shows the full range of Roz Chast's talent as a cartoonist and storyteller. Charles M. Blow is the New York Times visual op-ed columnist. Mr. Blow graduated magna cum laude from Grambling State University in Louisiana, where he received a BA in mass communications. Columbia University law professor, Patricia Williams, tells us that Charles Blow was only 24 when he was asked by the New York Times to direct its graphics department, apparently the youngest department head in the paper's history. His elegant charts, distillations of political and social complexity, jolted readers with their logic, lucidity, and sheer beauty. Before long, he ascended yet again, reinventing himself and configuring a new genre of journalism as the paper's visual op-ed columnist. In Fire Shut Up in My Bones, Charles Blow reveals that he was sexually abused at age 7 by a cousin who abused and bullied him for years to come, building a fiery rage that nearly caused him, when a college student, to kill this cousin. He realized he had to stop hating his abuser and start loving himself. Forgiveness was freedom. He had to let go of his past so that he could step into his future. He had to stop romanticizing the man he might have been and be the man that he was, not by neatly fitting into other people's definitions of masculinity or constructs of sexuality, but by being uniquely himself. In the words of Professor Williams, Fire Shut Up in My Bones is a story that builds and overwhelms. It's filled with a gathering roar, like an oncoming hurricane. By the last chapter, the tension explodes, then drops into a quiet sea of inner peace. With grace and eloquence, it resists the exclusions of either or. It presents conflicts central to humanity, reconfigured as fields of simple possibility, of compromise, of forgiveness, of eternal incompletion, of the fire unleashed at long last from our bones. Thank you.
Buenas tardes, everyone. Good afternoon. How are you doing? Good. Holding up? It's wonderful to be back home in Miami and wonderful to be home at Miami-Dade College in another way. I'm not sure if it's really widely known that when I first started writing, the little engineer that could, I guess, who wanted to start was curious about poetry. Actually, my first creative writing courses were right here in Miami-Dade, so it's home in many places in one, so thank you. I'd like to share with you just one excerpt and a few photos. The engineer can't go away from me. I have to do PowerPoint somehow. There's no charts and graphs, don't worry. But begin by saying just something that sort of guided my writing is that I think it was a poet. I can't remember exactly who. I've tried to research this, but that said that every writer, every poet in some way is writing one story or one poem all their life. And what that means figuratively, of course, is that that we all have a unique sort of central obsession, and that our whole body of work, that every poem we attempt or every story we attempt is in some way an attempt to dimension some aspect of that obsession, to ask questions about that obsession, to answer them and ask new ones and all the rest. And for me, that obsession comes down to one word: home. And all that big word means in terms of family, community, place, culture, cultural identity, national loyalties, all the rest. And it's no wonder, in a sense, it was something that's probably obsessed me even before birth. As I like to say, it was made in Cuba, assembled in Spain, and imported to the United States, which my mother left 7 months pregnant from Cuba to Madrid, where I was born, and 45 days later, we emigrated to the United States. So by the time I was 45 days old, I belonged to 3 countries. I had lived in 2 world-class cities. This is somewhat of a birth certificate, and then they threw in there the Eiffel Tower and the Swiss Alps just to screw with me even further. And that newborn photo that you see there was my green card photo, which was my very first ID in the United States. So if that wasn't a higher power saying, guess what little Ricky's going to be obsessed about when he grows up? Home, and all sorts of questions that brings into place. To continue that narrative, we moved, as Marilyn was saying, growing up in Miami still is very much like growing up between 2 imaginary worlds. One that was this 1950s and 60s Cuba. There's these stories in my parents' minds, these where the mangoes were juicier and the salt was sweeter, and there were real beaches, not that landfill of Miami Beach that we have to go to every weekend. But you know, that whole nostalgic thing, and it felt like a real place that I was from, but I had never been there. And the other imaginary sort of real world was the Brady Bunch, of course. And this is my fantasy one day, is to be able to be in that grid. That's a little photo of me. I had to nix Alice, but what can you do? So anyway, I just wanted to read you a little excerpt from the very first chapter, which is called the First Real San-Giving, which is how Latinos say Thanksgiving. It's San-Giving, like San Pedro or San Ignacio. It's a whole other kind of feast day that sort of captures just a little bit of the psychological sort of where the book begins in this negotiation between these 2 worlds. You'll also be introduced to my grandmother and another obsession of mine, which was El Winn-Dixie. So, which came to epitomize my mythic America, just like that forbidden grocery store of the 1970s that we wouldn't dare to go in. And so my grandmother and me are in cahoots in this, and it's part of the relationship that continues throughout the book. Every day after Abuela and Abuelo picked me up from school, she chased after specials on name brands and daily staples at one of 3 Cuban bodegas she frequented. Abuelo would pull his lawn chair from the trunk and camp under a palm tree in the parking lot, smoking a cigar and reading a Spanish translation of a dime store Western in the shade while he waited. Some days we went to La Sorpresita, the little surprise, the smallest of the 3 bodegas. Some days we went to El Gallo de Oro, the golden cock, where the Cuban bread was 10 cents cheaper than any place else. And other days to La Caridad, named after the patroness of Cuba, Our Lady of Charity. The neon virgin with flashing halo above the canopy was so lifelike that Abuela would insist I make the sign of the cross before going inside. And every single week I'd beg Abuela to go to El Winn-Dixie instead. But she refused to set foot in the place. There's none of our food in El Winn-Dixie. Only los Americanos shop there, Abuela sneered. It's too expensive anyway. She'd complain, dismissing my pleas, until the day she spotted a Winn-Dixie circular in the mail advertising a special too tempting for Abuela to ignore. A whole roasted chicken, its drumsticks crowned with fancy paper hats, and a banner beneath trumpeting its not-so-fancy price. Whole fryers, 29 cents per pound. What does whole fryer mean? Abuela asked me. Pollo entero, I translated. De verdad? She said incredulously. At La Caridad, I'd pay 34 cents on a special. I played on her piqued curiosity. Sí, Abuela. It's a great price for chicken. Increíble. You sure could save a lot of money. She agreed and left the circular on the kitchen counter instead of tossing it out with the rest of the junk mail that came in English. Few things intimidated Abuela. Among these were black magic, santeria, and Americanos. As for Americanos, Abuela wouldn't go anywhere she perceived to be wholly American, at least not alone. This included the Social Security office downtown, any restaurant with English-only menus, even Kim's Chinese Palace, fancy department stores like Burdine's, and definitely not Winn-Dixie. But Abuela also couldn't resist a bargain. The following week, the chicken appeared in the mail at 26 cents per pound, 3 cents cheaper than the week before, and then 24 cents the week after that. The friars hunted Abuela. Her stinginess slowly overcame her fear of Americanos until finally she broke. Mijo, will you go with me shopping at a Winn-Dixie mañana? She half asked, half commanded. Of course, Abuela, no te preocupes. I'll go with you. Soon I dreamed our pantry would be stocked with Crunch Berry cereals and Oreo cookies, our freezer stuffed with Swanson TV dinners and Eskimo pies, our fridge filled with Hawaiian punch and American cheese. The next day after school, Abuela instructed Abuela to drive to El Winn-Dixie instead of La Caridad. A gigantic red sign marked its entrance, the letters spelling out Winn-Dixie, the beef people, seeming to even glow even in daylight. What does the beef people mean? Abuela questioned me. I struggled for a translation that would make sense, but none did. La gente de carne, I finally offered. ¿Cómo? How can that be? Abuela said, perplexed by the thought of people made of meat, which is what my literal translation meant in Spanish. Why not the chicken people or the carne puerco people? She amused herself. Abuela tore the advertisement for the fryer from the flyer and stuffed it into her coin purse, which she stuffed into her brassiere and kissed Abuelo as if we might not return. Dios nos ampare. God be with us, she muttered. She said nothing until we reached the store entrance. Now, take me straight to Los Pollos. And no talking to no one. We don't belong here. The electric doors yawned open. I reached for a shopping cart twice as big as the ones at La Caridad, but Abuela tugged me back, saying, "Don't you dare," with her wide open eyes, too afraid to speak. I could barely speak myself, but not from fear, just from pure awe. I was finally in Winn-Dixie. The air-conditioned air smelled as crisp and clean as Lysol. Each of the 10 checkout lines was numbered with an illuminated sign, and the cashiers all wore polyester uniforms. Instead of warped squares of linoleum, polished terrazzo floors gleamed, and soft violin music rained from the speakers in the ceiling. I was finally in America. We stepped into the produce section full of fruits and vegetables I had never eaten or even heard of. Brussels sprouts, squash, tangelos, apricots. Brussels sprouts, squash, tangelos, apricots. I kept pronouncing them in my mind, trying to imagine the taste from the sound of their names. Pretending I was looking for the chickens, I deliberately wove Abuela through every aisle, taking it all in. The cartoon faces on the cereal boxes, the frost like snow on the freezer cases, flavors of Jell-O I never knew existed, raspberry, black cherry, soup made from cheddar cheese, from potatoes. I wanted to buy and taste everything I saw. But of all the things I had tried at Jimmy Dawson's house, my absolute favorite was Easy Cheese. And there, in the snack aisle, I saw it. "Can you buy me this, Abuela?" I said, grabbing a can off the shelf. "What's that?" she asked. "It's queso. Queso, Abuela. Queso americano. Please, it's my favorite," I begged. "What? Queso en una lata?" she questioned, unable to fathom the idea of cheese in a can. But I could tell from the tone of her voice that she was intrigued. "Look," I said, spraying a dab on my finger and licking it off. "You don't even need to put it in the refrigerator." "¿Qué cosa?" She looked at me, at my finger, at the can, and my finger at the can and back at me. Como inventan los americanos. She marveled at the ingenuity of Americans. Let me taste, she asked, holding out her finger. Ay, qué rico. She paused and then questioned, pero how much is it? Taking the can from my hand to look at the price. $1.35. Bueno, okay, but only if you promise to eat it all. I don't want to be wasting food. But let's get a fresh one, mijo, she said, putting the can back on the shelf and taking a new one. So, yeah, that's my grandma. But apparently that's very universal. Apparently everybody in the entire world and universe is guilty of doing that. So it's transcends culture, sexuality, everything you can imagine. Just want to run you a few slides and then I'll step off. Some of the characters. The concept of the book, The Prince of Los Cocuyos, is proverbially that whole it takes a village to raise a child, right? And so each chapter is sort of surrounded around a particular wonderful relationship that has somehow been amazing to me in my life, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons, but nonetheless part of the rearing of my psyche. One of them is my mother, of course, and I like to show this slide because that bag is actually a lightweight bag, a lightweight version of her 80-pound por si las moscas bag, which is an idiom that means just in case of the flies, which means to be prepared for the worst, like plagues of flies. So she had everything in there from toilet paper to nail polish to Tic Tacs to Band-Aids to mosquito repellent, and including, I think it's in chapter 4, a pistol on our first trip to Disney World because you never knew if a band of crazy Americanos was going to attack us north of the Miami city limits. So, but in reality, why I show that picture of her, my mother was actually, it's a cycle, as I learned writing the book, was a psychological response. The woman left her entire family in Cuba, and her sense of control was because inside she was dying, and that sense of loss. And so it was really this idea of the instability inside, the only thing she could do to react to that is try to control everything else that she could so that her life would have some sense of psychological stability. There's another, that's my father, and also another character called El Malibu, the 1970-something Malibu. My dad's first car, first American dream, a car that he paid more attention to than most of us. This is my older brother, who's 6.5 years older than me, which I think statistically is exactly the worst years that you can have two boys apart. So he's my superhero and my arch enemy. He's my babysitter, my torturer, and I knew how to play baby of the family, but I'm not innocent. Why I show this slide is, I always used to get my mother to dress us alike just to piss him off. So. One other character is my cat that follows me throughout the book, only because my grandmother was also very homophobic, and so, of course, cats were gay. Along with Fruit Loops and any number of things. And so the cat is my source, is in some ways a friend and a source of comfort, and also just to piss her off. There's another character, which is Miami. One of the important things for me to write this book is to show the Miami that I grew up in, the Miami that is not the Miami of today per se, but just like there wasn't the Miami of yesteryear, So our city we become stewards of our place, and we each contribute, and it contributes to us. But there's a lot of Miami, like Wolfie's and Burdines and these other kind of stores on there, and I really thought it was important to sort of be an emotional historian of what it felt like to live and grow up in that Miami. And this is a cocuyo. Un cocuyito, it's kind of like a firefly, same magic of catching, them with your father, and also it's the name of my granduncle's store, El Cocuyito. And so it's a big turning point in the book, because what's happened is Ricky's looking for his mythic America and Easy Cheese and in the Brady Bunch. The countercurrent is that he has this wonderful cultural coming of age and discovering the real essence of his Cuban heritage, of all these stories and this history that aren't just your parents babbling off. And that happens at the grocery store, and I started working there since I was 12, and that's sort of where Ricky becomes the prince in the sense of that village, and it's through the customers, the regulars that come in like 3 or 4 times a day, the other employees, the family that work there, because I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding sometimes that as children of immigrants, well, I'm an immigrant by 45 days, that we grow up, just love eating pork on Thanksgiving, and like that really the process of coming of age culturally is a process of falling in love and really coming to terms and maturing into your culture. And that's essentially what much of Los Cocuyos is, that sort of journey, cultural and all the rest. And last thing I will say, and I think I've been all right, I hope, is that the book is read in some ways, I see it as a sort of a great sort of American dream story, because you realize this little chubby kid who grew up behind Bird Bowl with a kooky grandmother who wants easy cheese and nothing else. In some ways, it still amazes me that happened to me in my life. And so it's a hopeful story, I think, in the sense that in the sense of the American dream, that wonderful things can still happen and are amazing in this country. So thank you.
I need it to be full screen. Okay.
All right, so here you're left
Okay.
and right. front
Okay,
left.
it's not up yet. Oh, there it is. Okay. Hi, my name's Roz Chast. I wrote a memoir called Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? It's about taking care of my parents at the end of their lives. And they grew up in New York, like me, and they lived in the same apartment in Brooklyn for 59 years. And when they were around 90, they started to fail. I was not living in Brooklyn. And so this memoir is a little bit about my taking care of them and a little bit about who they were and their relationship with one another and their relationship with me. Anyway, and this is at the beginning of the book. It's a little bit about what my childhood was like. It sort of explains a little bit about what they were like. This is the Wheel of Doom. And, no, hold on. Hey, tech person? This is advancing all by itself. This is starting to just advance by itself. I'm not touching it.
No, these should
Okay.
goes front and back,
No, I know. I haven't touched it. It's just starting to move.
unless you set a...
I'm sorry.
Do you see the guy in the third row completely asleep? Look, third row right in front of you. Huh? Is he still out? Yeah, completely asleep.
So it's not working now? Oh, okay. This is the Wheel of Doom. This explains a little bit about where my parents were at and the stories that I heard when I was growing up. And these all happened. Friend's husband killed by falling flower pot. Friend nearly blinded by mascara causing infection. Friend who traveled too much, jaundice. A rash, then dead. A headache, then dead. A lump, then dead. He was too happy. He jumped off a chair and broke his metatarsal. Guy who almost died after playing the oboe. This it was explained to me because my mother's brother played the jazz trumpet, and he knew this guy who played the oboe, and I was around 9 years old, and I heard him tell my mother, and one day he woke up, he was bleeding from every pore. And it was explained that because playing the oboe, it was like so much pressure to, blow the air on the reed that, boom, he just like exploded, I guess. Friend's son killed by baseball. Until I was about 13, I was afraid to sit directly on the ground because my mother knew a girl who sat directly on the ground, and she caught a cold in her kidneys and she died. Also, I mean, just like crazy stories. One time I found this bracelet that had sort of elastic on it, and it was a little bit tight. She said, take that off, you're gonna get gangrene, your hand will drop off. So this was their orientation to life. So this takes place, this cartoon takes place, I'm gonna read it because you probably can't, it's too bright to read. My parents and I never discussed death. So, do you guys ever think about things? And my father says, what kinds of things? Things, plans. I have no idea what you guys want. Now, at this point, they're like in the early 90s, they're still living in the apartment. Let's say something happened. Then my mother gives the universal sign for person is crazy. Am I the only sane person here? You know what? Never mind. Forget it. Que sera, sera. Later that day. Phew, phew, phew. Basically, it wasn't like I was trying to bring this conversation about their wishes at the end of life, and they were ignoring it. It was like all three of us had our heads stuck very deep into the sand, and so when stuff really started to happen, it was like, holy crap. I was quite aware that my parents had had tough lives, way, way tougher than mine. You don't know what trouble is, that's my mother saying. I had heard the stories my whole life about how their parents had come over from Russia at the turn of the century with nothing, about how my maternal grandfather had been an engineer in Russia, but how between his inability to speak English and his being Jewish, he wound up barely being able to support 5 kids and his wife working as a presser in the garment district, and how bitter and angry he was, and how my grandmother washed clothes for other people, and how even sadder my father's family was. His mother was one of 9 children. Not only that, but she was the only girl, not only was she the only girl, but she was also the only one of her siblings to survive the Russian cholera epidemic. Then in a forest, her father had his throat cut from ear to ear by bandits. I don't know what happened to her mother, but she came to New York, married my paternal grandfather, and had just one child, my father, by cesarean section in 1912. A horrible ordeal that involved, according to my mother, opening her up from her neck to her you-know-what. Between their one bad thing after another lives in the Depression and World War II and the Holocaust in which they both lost family, it was amazing that they weren't crazier than they were. Who could blame them for not wanting to talk about death? And this is where the title for the memoir comes from my father, who would always say, let's discuss a more pleasant subject. My parents referred to each other without any irony as soulmates. The rocks in his head match the holes in mine. They were born 11 days apart, and they grew up 2 blocks apart in East Harlem, New York City. They were in the same 5th grade class. They never dated, much less anything else to anyone besides each other. My father says, we were too poor. Plus, we lived with our parents till we were married. Aside from World War II, work, illness, and going to the bathroom, they did everything together. I'm going to Waldbaum's. Hold on, I'm coming too. My mother even washed my father's hair for him. It's not as if they never fought, because they did. Don't sit sideways, you're twisting your kishkas. Kishkas are intestines, for people who don't know. But the concept of looking for something better or being happy, that was for modern people or movie stars, i.e. degenerates. They were a tight little unit. Codependent? Of course we're codependent, thank God. Maybe they believed that if they just held on to each other really, really tightly for eternity, nothing would ever change. I visited them for the first time in years at their apartment in Brooklyn, where I grew up. What I noticed first was the level of grime. What is grime? It's not ordinary dust or a greasy stovetop that hasn't been cleaned in a week or 2. It's more of a coating, something that happens when people haven't cleaned in a really long time. One thing my mother always told me when I was growing up was, you have to dust. If you don't dust, the dust gets into all the interstices of the furniture and it breaks it all apart. It was clear that she had stopped worrying about that. But what do? If you pick up a sponge and start cleaning, look at me. It's perfect, daughter. It will not necessarily be perceived as helpful. The person you're trying to help might even feel insulted or embarrassed. Put that down. Leave that alone. Don't touch that. Daddy and I are fine. Don't upset your mother. I wasn't great as a caretaker, and they were not great at being taken care of. By 2002, they were 90. It was hard not to notice that every time I came to visit, the grime had grown thicker, the piles of newspapers, magazines, and junk mail had grown larger, than they themselves had grown frailer. I could see that they were slowly leaving the sphere of TV commercial old age, spry, totally independent, just like a normal adult, but with silver hair. This is like, the ads you see for Insure or something, and the people are 55. It's like, and moving into a part of old age that was scarier, harder to talk about, and not a part of this culture. And here's this scientist guy that I like to draw on. He's saying, extend the human lifespan to 140. I'm thinking this guy doesn't know anybody over 100. Something was coming down the pike. It's no accident that most consumer ads are pitched to people in their 20s and 30s. I'm going to take up golf and tennis, so I'm going to need a lot of new stuff. Let's redecorate the house. For one thing, they are less likely to have gone through the transformative process of cleaning out their deceased parents' stuff. Once you go through that, you can never look at your stuff the same way. You start to look at your stuff a little post-mortemistically. If you've lived more than 2 decades as a consumer, you have probably quite the accumulation, even if you're not a hoarder. An ergonomic garlic press, and throw pillows, and those stupid sunflower dessert plates, and 7 travel alarm clocks, and 8 nail clippers, and a colander, and a flat iron, and 3 old laptops, and barbells, and a set of fucking bocce balls, and patio furniture, and an auto harp, for God's sake, and your old flute from high school, and a zillion books, and towels, and sheets, and a wok you never used. And this is like a typical thing when I would visit my parents. Mom, what is with this oven mitt? It's from the year 1. It's disgusting. It's all burnt and it's cruddy and it's got patches on it. Oh my God, these patches come from a skirt I made 40 years ago in home ec. Please let me buy you a new oven mitt. And my mother's, why waste your money? That one still works. I'm gonna go a little faster, so I'm gonna skip a couple things. Sorry. This is a typical conversation that I had with my mother over the phone, because there were a few years there where I was starting to visit them a lot, but they had no desire to move out of their apartment, but things were kind of starting to go downhill. How's your so this is me. How's your cataract removal operation recovery coming along? Great. It's like there was a yellow scrim over everything, and now it's gone. I still have the patch over the eye, though, but not to worry. There's plenty of food in the house. Daddy and I just came back from Wallbounds. Now, my father never learned how to drive. He was too anxious, so my mother drove. And she was the archetypal little old lady with the big giant car, like this. And I don't know if any of you know Brooklyn, but like they had to cross Ocean Parkway to get to Wallbounds. And this is like a 6-lane, very busy road. Mom, listen to me. You can't drive with one eye. You have no depth perception. Oh, not a problem. Daddy guided me. And these were some of the things that happened later. At some point, my mother did have to go to the hospital, and she was there for 3 weeks. And my father came to live with us in Connecticut for those weeks because he could not live alone. He had senile dementia, but what happens when sometimes people have senile dementia, as many of you may know, is that as long as they're in their familiar circumstances, a lot of the symptoms can be sort of, you're not aware of how demented, how much senility they really have. So, anyway, well, I'll read the second one. Dad, what do you think of this sweater? I'm holding up this red sweater, because his clothes were in tatters. They hadn't gone clothes shopping in a really long time, and I wanted to be the good daughter and buy some clothes for him. I can't wear that. Why not? It's red. Communism? I'm going to skip this one. My mother had a strong aversion to doctors and hospitals. It didn't surprise me that she didn't want to call in the cavalry. Doctors, they have a God complex. They tell you to do something, then it's next month, never do that thing. Some people think doctors walk on water, but not me. And hospitals, don't get me started. Here's what I think about hospitals. That's where you go to die. The body wants to be well. I'm a Jewish Christian Scientist. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna skip a little. Okay, finally, I got them to an assisted living place. My mother was constantly falling. My father was leaving the stove on. I was terrified to answer the phone because I thought, this is gonna be the call from the police. My parents blew up the apartment house. So finally, I did get them to an assisted living place about 10 minutes from where I live in Connecticut. The first few months were fairly uneventful, although sometimes I had the feeling that my dad was less than 100% enthusiastic. This place is a hellhole. I knew it wasn't a hellhole, but even a top of the middle of the line or bottom of the top of the line place is still an institution, and institutions have rules. Your father doesn't like to bathe. This is every week, there'd be like an assessment meeting with the staff. My mother never called it a hellhole, but she had opinions. We're not residents, we're inmates. I'm sure it wasn't easy, but they were adjusting. Your father had an egg in his pocket all day yesterday. Thank God it turned out to be hard-boiled. And this is a typical afternoon at the place. Look, Dad, I brought you a cheese Danish. My favorite. Honey, care to share this with me? My mother says, no, because I ate my lunch, unlike some people who were so busy socializing that they neglected their lunch, which is why some people are hungry now. I'll cut it into quarters. That way, if you change your mind, you can have some. As I told you, I'm still full from lunch. Then I'll cut it in half, and I'll eat one half, and I'll put the other half away for later. Watch. He'll forget, he'll eat both halves. And then some people won't be hungry for dinner. And then here's me, because I'm so brilliant. Mom, I don't get why you're the boss of Dad's Danish ingestion. Actually, your mother's right. She's a brilliant woman. Thank you, Elizabeth. I always made sure their door had decor. There's a little hook on the back, see? This is the door at the assisted living place. Indian corn, flowers, things like that. They didn't know Indian corn. I mean, they lived in Brooklyn. People didn't decorate their door. They lived in an apartment house. It's very lovely. What is that called again? No wreaths. One had limits. Door decor was not an important part of my parents' old lives. Why would anybody want to call attention to their door? Besides, it's a waste of money. But when in Rome, I didn't want other residents to think they were weird or anti-door decor. And these are two other residents. I heard the Chasts are from New York. Here's what I used to think happened at the end. One day, old Mrs. McGillicuddy felt unwell and she took to her bed. She stayed there for, about 3 or 4 weeks, growing weaker by the day. One night, she developed something called a death rattle, and soon after that, she died. The end. What I was starting to understand was the middle panel was sometimes a lot more painful, humiliating, long-lasting, complicated, and hideously expensive. And I'll summarize this a little bit. My father, when he was 95, his hip broke, and he started to seriously decline. And hospice entered the picture. And this was what my mother said. She said, so, the hospice lady has started coming around. She was very nice, but I told her, I don't want anybody coming around here with a long, sad face. I want positive thinking, not a bunch of people standing around singing Kumbaya. And then my father, he did die at 95, and my mother was alive for another 2 years, and with many, many ups and downs. It was very intense. And when she was around 97, she went into her, she was in hospice twice. She was very good at it. And, The second time she was in hospice, the decline went on a little longer, and some strange things started to happen. She started to, I think, start to lose her marbles a little bit, and she would tell me these strange stories, and I started keeping track of them. So here's a few of them. Dead dad. Your father died before you were born, when I was pregnant with you. My father, Harry, said he would buy me a house, and he would live with us and babysit you while I was at work. Mom, that's not true. Yes, it is, and I should know. Okay, ass full of buckshot. There was a break-in at the place. All the men were moved over to the women's side. I shot the intruder with my BB gun. I gave him an ass full of buckshot. I'd like to stand him on a stage, pull down his pants, and take out the pellets one by one in front of everybody. Unusual adoption. Did I ever tell you about how the Miltons got Paula? Now, I had heard the story, but it wasn't like this. They went out shopping, and when they got back to their car, there was a grocery bag leaning against the wheel, and inside the bag was a baby. And then the story stopped, and I was continuing to visit her, and there was really not much to do besides draw. And I guess it's because it's what I do. And I really was not aware of why completely I was doing it. I just knew that I needed to. I think I wanted to look at her and be with her, and drawing was a way for me to do that. So I did a lot of sketches of her. I don't know if you can see them very well here, but and that's the last one. You know, was very surreal. Her helper called me when my mother was passing, and I drove down there as fast as I could, and I guess she just sort of slipped away. And when I got down there, you know, there's all this official hustle and bustle that has to happen, and they just sort of left me with her for about 15 minutes, and so I drew her, and that was that. This is just the last one, I think. On the floor of my closet, along with shoes, old photo albums, wrapping paper, a sewing machine, a shelf of old sleep t-shirts and iron, a carton of my kids' artwork, and some other miscellaneous stuff are 2 special boxes. One holds my father's cremains, the other holds my mother's. My father's box is inside a navy blue velvet drawstring bag, which I placed inside the ancient Channel 13 bag that he took everywhere. My mother's box is inside a maroon velvet drawstring bag. It is en plein air. Until I figure out a better place for them, they're staying in my closet. Actually, this is the last one. I wish that at the end of the life, when things were truly done, there was something to look forward to, something more pleasure-oriented, perhaps opium or heroin. So you became addicted. So what? All-you-can-eat ice cream parlors for the extremely aged, big art picture books and music, extreme palliative care for when you've had it with everything else. The x-rays, the MRIs, the boring food, and the pills don't do anything at all. Would that be so bad? And that's it.
Have to adjust this up a little bit. So we're backstage, we were trying to figure out what the order was going to be and who was going to go first, and I figured that since they had slides, I should go last. I don't know if I picked that appropriately. I might have made a bad mistake there. We only have about 15 minutes left in this session, so I'm going to go as fast as I can to make sure that we fit everything in. The title of my memoir is Fire Shut Up in My Bones. It's a coming-of-age story about growing up in North Louisiana. A very small town, a segregated town, probably about 1,000 people when I was born. And I'm always fascinated by the kind of response to the book. There are a couple of questions that I think people ask all the time. One of them is, why now, which I think is a very strange question to answer because if anybody's writing a book, it takes forever to produce. So I started 9 years ago. So when they say, well, why now? I say, well, why not then? Because it really does take everything out of you just to complete it. And there are points when you feel like you are literally going to die, and that it will never fully be finished. I remember James Baldwin once was being interviewed by Studs McKinsey about finishing his first book, and he said, well, I thought I would never finish, and he went away to Switzerland. And you know how James Baldwin talks. It was all white mountains and white faces. That's James Baldwin. That's my best James Baldwin. And he said he took with him one typewriter and also one Bessie Smith album. And he said that he had never allowed himself to listen to Bessie Smith in America, but there in Switzerland, surrounded by these white mountains and these white faces, he listened to Bessie Smith. And part of that was because he wanted to remind himself of what he must have sounded like as a child before he learned to hate himself. And I thought that was incredibly poetic and powerful, so I created a soundtrack so that I could write. But the other question that people ask is, why did you write the book? Which I find, in a way, an even harder question to answer because it is not a literary question. It's a sociological question. It's a question that you ask to the essayist, but not the memoirist. The memoirist writes because there's a story in them that they must exhale. They write it because they need to read it. And, Maya Angelou used to say, the bird doesn't sing because it has an answer. The bird sings because it has a song. And so in a way, the writing of the memoir becomes the song of the bird. But I do understand what they're saying when they ask, why did you write the book? Because they're asking about the sociological themes of the book. It is more a marketing question than it is a literary question. However, I've learned to answer that question because it is true that the memoir for me has many sociological themes, and those are themes like family and poverty and race to a certain degree, identity and abuse. And so what I want to do is to just talk about those concepts and those constructs as they present themselves in my book. And I have a couple of passages here I want to read to you. First one I want to read is about family. And it is really about, I always read this, and it's kind of one of the at the beginning of the book. But it says so much to me about the complexities of the family, the intergenerational experiences of families, and how all that intersects with things like poverty and our experiences of love and pain and loss. And let me just read this piece for you. It's actually chapter 1, which is called The House with No Steps. The first memory I have in the world is of death and tears. That is how it would mark the beginning of my life, the way people mark the end of one. My family had gathered at Papa Joe's house because Ma'am Grace was slipping away, only I didn't register it that way. For some reason, I thought it was her birthday. Papa Joe was my great-grandfather. Ma'am Grace was his laid-up wife who passed the days in a hospital bed squeezed into their former den, looking out through a large picture window that faced the street, watching the world she was leaving literally pass her by. We were in the living room when he called to us. I think she's about to go. I didn't know what that meant. I thought it was time to give her a gift. With that, my family filed into her room, surrounding her with love. Their hearts were heavy. Mine, though, was light. I thought we were about to give her something special. They knew something special was about to be taken away. She peacefully drew her last breath as her head tilted and she fell still. No dramatic death rattle, no fear-tinged soliloquy, no last-minute confession. Like a raft pushed gently from the shore, she drifted quietly from now into forever. A beautiful life, beautifully surrendered. But I recorded it differently. I thought she turned to see a gift that wasn't there and that something went tragically wrong in the turning. When Ma'am Grace left the room, she took the air with her. No one could breathe. They could only scream. My mother was overcome. She ran from the house and I ran behind her. She threw herself to the ground near the hog pen, wailing, her back rocking against it. I shooed the hogs away as they tried to lap at her hair. I was too young to know what it meant to die, but tears I knew. Sorrow flowed out of my mother like a dam had broken. It was one, though, that she would soon rebuild, taller and stronger than it had been. As a child, I would never see my mother cry again. I spent most of my life believing my 3-year-old's version of what happened that day, until as an adult, I recounted my memory to my mother and she set the story straight. Our gathering at Ma'am Grace's bedside was not to celebrate the day she was born, but to accept that it was her day to die. Now, part of the reason that my mom had such a strong reaction to that was part of the complexities of family. My mom had been raised by my grandmother because my grandmother and my grandfather, these were two people who should never have been married in the first place. These are, those couples where they just amp each other up and it's just like, does anybody have any control here at all? Like, this is what it's hurt. So they were that couple, right? So they just amp each other up. And so they moved away to Houston, and my mom stayed out there for, I think, a month or two. I don't know how long she stayed, and she was like, I have to get out of here. She they put her on a bus, and she came back from Houston to Louisiana as a kid on a bus by herself. This was also something done before, a long time ago. I didn't know this, but like they would put you on a bus with a note or on a train with a note, and this is where you were going, and you would arrive. It's like mail or something. So that was kind of her mother. And so she spent her entire life looking up to my great-grandmother as if it was her mother, and kind of, in a way, rebelling against her own mother, who was kind of a very different quality of woman and very flamboyant. So my mother is very staid. So she's one of the most conservative women you've ever met. So she has 4 colors in her closet: white, black, brown, navy blue. Things that are some combination of those things. There is no red, there is no green, there's none of that. There's no eyebrow plucking, because my great-grandmother, told her a woman once plucked her eyebrows, she went blind. You don't start something on a Friday that you can't finish, because my great-grandmother said a woman once did that. She started making a dress for her little girl. The little girl died. They had to bury the girl in a little dress. My mother doesn't do that. Like everything my great-grandmother said, that's how my mother lived her life, which was the opposite of the way my grandmother lived her life. My grandmother is one of these women who has been married. She was married like 4 times. And she's not the single girl. She did not like to be without a man. There's some people who can do that, not my grandmother, And she married for the 4th time a man who I consider to be like a father to me, because I grew up with him and her for the first 3 years of my life. Every time my mother got pregnant, she got dreadfully ill. And so my grandmother would pitch in and say, give me that kid. You can't even get out of bed, and I'll help you with this kid until you get older. So I stayed there with him for 3 years. But the 4th husband was, to me, just an amazing human being. I'll just read you a quick description of him, and then I'll read you something about one of the other sociological points of the book, which I think is really important for me as a writer, which was to establish the incredible diversity of masculinity, particularly as it relates to African-American men. Because in literature and in film, I think that it is drawn much too narrowly, and we do not see all of the fullness that people can be, particularly men can be. And particularly, we can't see the gentle person and the person who would do anything for love. Jed, this is the 4th husband. Jed was a chain smoker with a strong back and soft eyes. It was those eyes that struck you, brown, maple syrup sweet, a hint of gray around the edges, sunrise yellow where the white should be, deep enough to get lost in, bottomless like Martin's Pond, damp like the beginning of a good cry or the end of a good laugh. They were the kind of eyes that saw down into the dark of you and drew up the light, the kind that melted worry like a stick of butter near a warm stove, the kind that forgave secret shame before it scarred the throat on the way out. It would take a man with eyes like that to make Big Mama move to the middle of nowhere and bathe outside. Now, Big Mama, that's my grandmother. Now, Big Mama would not move into the middle of nowhere for anybody other than for this man. This is, she lost her third husband because she was using the car note money to buy, clothes and shoes. And he didn't know. He was illiterate, and so he trusted her with the money. So she was like, you pay the note. So she's like, yeah, give me the money. I'll pay the note. So she gave him the money. I think she might have paid it one time. So she gave him the receipt. She put it away. He put it away. She gave him the receipt. He put it away. But she would steal it back. Every time he put it away, use the car note money to go buy clothes and give him the same receipt again because he couldn't read it. So the repossession guy came to show up and said, we got to take the car back. And he's irate. He's like, no, my wife pays the note on time every month. I have all the receipts. So he goes into the box where he's been putting in receipts. He can find one, the one she's been recycling. So my grandmother's not that kind of guy, but Jed completely changes her. And so I want to read you this quick little passage. The only remnant of Big Mama's past was a water-damaged, hand-tinted portrait of her and a man I didn't recognize, both sugar sharp, sitting on a bench in front of a painted backdrop. He was sitting up tall and strong. She was laughing, legs crossed, her head resting delicately on his shoulder. There was a power in his pose, but there was more in hers, a feminine power, the kind that lights a room and buckles a knee, the kind that makes men do things they know they shouldn't, sneak in through open windows, lie to loved ones, give more than they have. I often stared at that picture, trying to connect that woman, thin, young, radiant, dangerously alluring, with the woman I knew now as Big Mama, but I couldn't do it. She was different now. Jed had made her different because he was more powerful than she was. He drew his power from a different source, not from hollowness, but from wholeness. It was a grand, simple kind of power. It came from the knowing and accepting and loving of self that made the knowing and accepting and loving of everything else possible. It didn't crush, but accommodated. He hadn't taken away Big Mama's power, but given her a peaceful place to harness and transform it, to calm down and grow up, to move out of the woman she had been and into the woman she could be. She was like a river, always running, never still, wanting to be somewhere other than where it was, that had finally reached the ocean, vast and deep, and exactly where it was always meant to be. And thank you. I particularly love the idea of thinking about masculinity as an ocean, because I think that we, as a culture, draw masculinity dangerously, precariously narrow, and basically weed boys out and make them feel like they are constantly failing because we have defined it as a peak to which we must ascend, a side of a mountain that we must scale, rather than as the ocean. Deep in some places, and shallow in some places, and roiling in some places, and placid in some places, and that all of that is part of what it means to be a man. And basically by removing that, we rob these boys of a basic part of humanity. And so they believe that they are constantly failing to be what we have done to them as boys. It is almost like the person who writes the note of a song so high that only a few people are ever meant to reach the note and no one is ever meant to hold it. That is what we have done. and that is what we must undo. Another kind of one of the sociological themes about the book is poverty, and it's really about what rural poverty looks like. We constantly, in our kind of political discourse, talk about poverty only as urban poverty. We talk about it only as people who do not work, and therefore it is an effort deficiency. You are poor because you did not try hard enough. But that is not the way that I experienced poverty. It was not urban, and everyone worked, and some people worked more than one job. And the poverty that I understood had nothing to do with lack of effort. It's just that they did not make enough to lift themselves out of poverty. So I'm gonna read this quickly. At the house with no steps, I had not sensed our shortness of money, but now it was all too apparent. We hadn't been well off before, but now we would truly struggle. Most of the blacks in town lived in some gradation of poverty, some barely eking out an existence, some whose existence could hardly be called living. Poor as Job's turkey, my mother called it. They were the kind of folks who did hard jobs and odd jobs, any work they could find to keep the lights on and the children fed. They were women whose skin glistened from steam and sweat, whose hands stayed damp from being dipped in buckets and dried on aprons. They were men who worked in boots with steel toes, the kind that didn't take shining, the kind that leaned over and told stories when you took them off. They were people whose bodies melted every night in a hot bath, but stiffened by sunrise, so much so that it took pills to get them out of bed without pain. Yet they seemed to me content in what they knew life to be, sharing old stories, deep laughs, and sweet tea. As the old folks had imparted to me early on, grandeur never witnessed could not be coveted. Another thing that it was a big theme of the book that a lot of reviewers have focused on is the abuse piece of it. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and I don't think that we fully understand what sexual abuse is in America because we have one concept of what it is. We have the Catholic priest Jerry Sandusky grown up, the To Catch a Predator concept of what sexual abuse is. It is a stranger. It is always an adult. It is always towards an older kid. It is penetrative. That is not what sexual abuse is in America, and we have to dispel ourselves of that mythology. Very often, it is a friend of the family or someone who is in the family. It is not a stranger. Very often it is happening in your home. It is not away at school or church or some Boy Scout meeting or what have you. And very often it is not even an adult to a child. It is children. The number one age of abusers in America is not an adult, but 14 years old. 14 also happens to be the number one age of those abused, but half of all abused children are under 12 years old. And of that cohort, the number one age is 4 years old. We have to change our concepts of what abuse looks like because we are looking for something other than what is happening right under our faces in our own homes or on the play date or when someone goes to sleep over. And it is not always penetrative. It is a lot of touching, fondling. All of that leaves the same scar because it is emotional, it is a spiritual scar. We have to change the way we think about abuse. This is something I write, this is one paragraph I write about the experience of right after the abuse. I don't know how to describe the sound of a world crashing. Maybe there is no sound, just a great emptiness, an enveloping sorrow, a creeping nothingness that coils itself around you like a stiff wire. I wanted to cry, but couldn't. I wanted to scream, but couldn't. I was dead now, and dead boys forget how to cry. Part of that damage is not even the abuse itself, but it is what society puts on to the abused child. They abuse children over again, and a lot of times it is done by the people who care, the people who are outraged by it. Because if you dig deep enough into the outrage, a lot of it is laced in misogyny and patriarchy and homophobia. Because what society tells the kid is that you are dead, because you are irrevocably ruined, that you have been spoiled, that you have been destroyed, that your manhood has been taken. And that is not real, and it is not true. And it has a lot of very negative connotations in it. What is true is that there has been a betrayal of trust. There has been an exploitation of a power differential. There has been an invasion of your zone of intimacy and sovereignty of your most intimate self. Those things you can recover from. The suffocation of society that tells you that you are forever broken and beyond repair is much harder to recover from. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to read this one last paragraph. I'm going to skip a lot of the sociology here. I'm just going to read this one last piece, which is about learning to love yourself and having the courage to confess to yourself and to the world that you are strong and resilient and deserving of a life. Concealment makes the soul a swamp. Confession is how you drain it. Daring to step into oneself is the bravest, strangest, most natural, most terrifying thing a person can do. Because when you cease to wrap yourself in artifice, you are naked. And when you are naked, you are vulnerable. But vulnerability is the leading edge of truth. Being willing to sacrifice a false life is the only way to live a true one. Thank you very much.